In the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, where the pines whispered secrets older than the land itself, the Donnelly farm crouched like a forgotten relic, its weathered barns sagging under the weight of unspoken sins. The air up there carried a peculiar chill, not just from the altitude, but from something deeper, something that clung to the skin like damp fog. Folks in the valley below rarely spoke of the Donnellys, and when they did, it was in hushed tones over flickering lantern light, as if naming them might summon the devil himself. The family had been there since the dust of the Great Depression settled, or so the stories went, generations folding in on themselves, bound by blood and isolation, in a place where the outside world felt like a distant dream. Elijah Donnelly, the grizzled patriarch with eyes like chipped flint, ruled over it all, his word law in a kingdom of rusting tractors and overgrown fields. But on nights when the wind howled through the canyons, carrying faint echoes of cries that might have been human or beast, one couldn't help but wonder what twisted roots lay buried beneath that cursed soil. It started innocently enough, with a lost hiker stumbling upon the property line, drawn by the flicker of a lantern in the distance, a light that promised shelter but delivered only the first glimpse into a nightmare woven from flesh and fate. As the stranger approached, the shapes in the windows shifted, watching, waiting, their forms blurred by more than just the grimy glass. In the winter of 1876, amid the unforgiving vastness of Montana's remote wilderness, Dr. Theodore Brennan, a physician traveling through the territory on a routine medical call, found himself drawn off the faint trail by an unexpected sight, a thin plume of smoke rising from a hidden valley where no settlement was marked on any map. Exhausted from days of navigating snow-choked passes, he urged his horse forward, hoping for shelter against the biting cold that clawed through his coat. As he descended into the secluded hollow, the Donnelly homestead emerged like a specter from the pines, a cluster of rough-hewn cabins and sagging barns, encircled by a crude fence that seemed more barrier than boundary, its posts weathered to a ghostly gray. The place felt wrong from the first glimpse, too still, too silent for a working farm in daylight hours. No dogs barked in greeting, no children played in the yard, and the livestock penned nearby moved with a lethargic unease, their eyes wide and unblinking. Brennan approached cautiously, his boots crunching through crusted snow, noting the odd details that prickled his instincts. Windows shuttered despite the pale sun, doors reinforced with heavy iron bolts, and strange markings etched into the wood, symbols that might have been wards against evil or something far more personal. Knocking at the main cabin door, he was met by a figure who opened it only a crack at first, peering out with eyes set too close, features subtly asymmetrical in a way that suggested more than frontier hardship. The woman who eventually admitted him, Bring Donnelly, as she introduced herself in a voice barely above a whisper, moved with a hesitant gait, her hands trembling as she gestured him inside. The interior reeked of herbs and something metallic beneath, the air thick with unspoken tension. Other family members lingered in the shadows, pale faces with overlapping resemblances, limbs proportioned oddly, gazes that darted away too quickly. Subtle deformities, a clubbed foot here, an unnaturally elongated finger there hinted at generations warped by isolation, behaviors marked by wary silence and instinctive clustering, as if the outside world were a threat long feared. Brennan's medical eye caught these abnormalities immediately, stirring a chill deeper than the mountain wind. What he mistook for simple misfortune would soon unravel into revelations of deliberate design, but in that initial encounter, as he tended to a feverish child whose skin bore faint, unnatural ridges, the homestead's veil began to thin, exposing the first threads of a genetic nightmare concealed for decades in Montana's forgotten reaches. In the dim glow of a kerosene lamp inside the Donnelly cabin, Dr. Theodore Brennan sat by the fire, his hands still numb from the ride, as Elijah Donnelly, the stern patriarch with a beard like tangled wire, reluctantly allowed him to stay the night. What began as polite conversation about the harsh Montana winter shifted when Brennan, sensing the family's guarded demeanor, inquired about their origins. Elijah spoke vaguely of fleeing famine in Ireland decades earlier, but it was young Bridie, one of the daughters with her unsettlingly wide-set eyes and hesitant speech, who fetched a weathered trunk from beneath a floorboard at her father's nod. Inside lay bundles of yellowed papers, letters sealed with faded wax, meticulous ledgers charting births, marriages, and deaths, and journals bound in cracked leather, their pages filled with cramped handwriting that spanned generations. Brennan, trained in the emerging sciences back east, pored over them by lamplight, his initial curiosity giving way to a creeping dread. The records traced the Donnelly line back to the late 18th century in County Cork, where an ancestor, driven by pseudoscientific fervor inspired by early eugenic ideas circulating among European intellectuals, had initiated a deliberate program of close-kin unions to purify and strengthen the bloodline, believing it would breed resilience against hardship. Entries detailed arranged marriages between siblings and cousins, justified as preserving superior traits amid persecution and poverty. By the time the family crossed the Atlantic and homesteaded in Montana's remote valleys during the post-Civil War rush, the practice had become entrenched doctrine, enforced to isolate desirable characteristics like endurance in brutal conditions. Yet the ledgers revealed the grim truth: increasing infant mortality, deformities, and mental frailties noted with cold detachment, as if documenting livestock breeding gone awry. Brennan's pulse quickened as he uncovered references to correspondence with shadowy figures, anonymous benefactors who supplied funds and encouraged continuation, hinting at ties to fringe scientific societies obsessed with human improvement during an era when such notions flirted with the mainstream. These patrons, operating under the veil of secrecy, viewed the Donnellys as a living experiment in genetic isolation, far from prying eyes in the untamed West, where results could be observed without interference. The implications sank in like the mountain cold. This was no mere frontier eccentricity born of necessity, but a calculated, multi-generational endeavor rooted in misguided ideology, its horrors compounded by the family's unwavering commitment. As Elijah watched him with those flint-hard eyes, Brennan realized the homestead's barriers were not just against wolves or weather, but to conceal a lineage twisted by design. As dawn broke over the Donnelly homestead, painting the snow-capped peaks in pale gold, Dr. Theodore Brennan emerged from the cramped guest room where he'd spent a restless night, haunted by the muffled whispers seeping through the thin walls. The family gathered in the main cabin for breakfast, moving with a synchronized wariness that set his nerves on edge. Elijah sat at the head of the rough-hewn table, his massive frame dominating the space, while the others, Bridie, her brothers Caleb and Josiah, and a cluster of younger ones, took their places in silence, heads bowed as if awaiting judgment. Brennan's gaze lingered on them, his physician's training sharpening his observations into something akin to alarm. Caleb, broad-shouldered yet with a peculiar hunch that twisted his spine, chewed his food with jerky movements, his jaw protruding unevenly, teeth crowded and misaligned in a way that spoke of inherited malformation. Josiah's fingers, long and spindly, drummed restlessly on the table, ending in nails thickened and yellowed, while his eyes, pale blue like the others, darted with an unnatural rapidity, as if tracking threats only he could see. The children, ranging from toddlers to teens, bore overlapping features, high foreheads sloping sharply, ears set low on elongated skulls, and skin so pallid it seemed translucent under the lantern light, veined faintly blue. Their behaviors unnerved him further. Conversations halted abruptly when he entered, replaced by sidelong glances and murmurs in a dialect thick with archaic turns, laced with repetitive phrases echoed among them like a private code. Bridie, attempting hospitality, offered him coffee with hands that trembled, her speech halting and slurred around certain sounds, as if her tongue struggled against the shape of her mouth. One young boy stared fixedly at Brennan, rocking slightly, emitting soft clicks from his throat that the others ignored but which echoed unnaturally in the confined space. Subtle physical oddities compounded the unease, a girl's webbed toes peeking from worn boots, another's gait lopsided from shortened limbs, and across the board, a sameness in expression, vacant yet intensely watchful, that hinted at diminished faculties, passed down and amplified through blood too closely shared. Elijah's commanding presence enforced order, his voice booming corrections when a child strayed too near the outsider, but even he displayed tells, knuckles swollen grotesquely, a tremor in his left hand betraying early degeneration. As Brennan engaged them in halting talk about the weather and crops, the air grew thick with unspoken tension, their collective gaze weighing on him like a physical force. These were not the marks of mere hardship or malnutrition, but the insidious signatures of generations confined, mating within their own shadowed circle, warping body and mind in ways that nature recoiled from yet blood demanded. As the days blurred into a tense confinement, snowstorms trapping Dr. Brennan at the Donnelly homestead longer than intended, he observed the iron grip of Elijah's rule, a patriarchy forged in blood and scripture twisted to justify their isolation. Mornings began with the family assembled in the main cabin, Elijah presiding like a prophet from his carved oak chair, his voice rumbling through prayers that invoked purity and divine selection, words laced with warnings against the corrupt world beyond the mountains. No one spoke out of turn. Deviations earned sharp rebukes or worse, a backhanded cuff that silenced even the adults. Marriages were decreed by Elijah alone, pairings announced with solemn ritual, always between close kin to keep the line strong, as he phrased it, his eyes daring any to question. Brennan witnessed one such betrothal. Young Miriam, barely 16 with her mother's sloping brow and father's intense stare, promised to her cousin Amos, their union framed as sacred duty rather than choice. Protests were crushed swiftly. Miriam's initial tears met with Elijah's unyielding decree that straying blood invited weakness, disease, the wrath of God. Internal conflicts simmered beneath the obedience. Late at night, Brennan overheard muffled arguments from the adjoining rooms, Caleb challenging a minor edict, his voice rising in frustration over withheld rations, only to be quelled by Elijah's thunderous reminders of past punishments. Josiah, more withdrawn, harbored a quiet rebellion, his sketches hidden in rafters depicting fantastical escapes, figures fleeing into open skies, discovered and burned when found. The women bore the brunt, their days endless cycles of labor under Bridie's watchful eye, but whispers among them revealed suppressed longings, tales of valley towns traded in secret, dreams of lives unbound by the family's creed. Suppressed rebellions flickered and died, like a previous generation's attempt when Elijah's own sister had defied a match, her pleas ignored until isolation and coercion broke her spirit, leaving her a shadow haunting the barns. Elijah enforced it all with a mix of charisma and cruelty, bestowing favors on the compliant, isolating dissenters in windowless sheds during blizzards, where cold and darkness served as lessons in submission. The rules extended to every facet. No outsiders courted, no education beyond basic scripture that reinforced their exceptionalism, no medical aid sought that might expose their afflictions. Yet cracks appeared in private moments, a child's innocent question about the world below met with hesitation, a shared glance heavy with unspoken resentment hinting at the psychological fracture lines running through the family, where devotion warred with the innate human pull toward freedom. On a moonless night weeks into his enforced stay, as howling winds rattled the cabin shutters, Dr. Theodore Brennan was jolted awake by a commotion outside, muffled shouts, the crunch of boots in snow, and a high-pitched cry that pierced the darkness like a blade. Slipping to the frost-rimed window, he peered into the yard illuminated by swinging lanterns, where shadowy figures dragged a struggling form toward the main house. It was young Miriam, the betrothed girl whose impending union to her cousin had hung over the homestead like a storm cloud. Barefoot despite the bitter cold, her nightgown torn and blooded at the hem, she thrashed against the iron grips of Caleb and Josiah, her brothers turned jailers under Elijah's command. "Let me go. The valley, there's life down there," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation, words tumbling out in a rush that revealed weeks of secret planning, stolen glances at Brennan's maps, whispered dreams of escape fueled by his unwitting tales of the world beyond. Elijah emerged from the shadows, his silhouette massive and unyielding, a length of rope coiled in his hands. Miriam's pleas turned to sobs as she was hauled into the barn, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them. Brennan pressed against the glass, heart pounding, as the lantern's glow seeped through cracks, casting erratic shadows of raised arms and flailing limbs. The sounds that followed were visceral thuds of fists on flesh, the sharp crack of a belt, Miriam's cries escalating into animalistic wails before choking off into whimpers. The violence was methodical, designed not just to punish but to break, isolation in the cold loft, bindings that chafed skin raw, deprivation of food until submission came. Brennan learned later, from overheard fragments, that this was no isolated incident. Previous runaways, Elijah's own aunt decades prior, a cousin lost to the wilds, had been retrieved similarly, their bodies marked with scars that served as warnings etched in flesh. Miriam's attempt exposed the brutal machinery keeping the family's secrets intact, patrols along hidden trails, traps set for the unwary, a network of loyalty enforced by fear. By morning, she was returned to the cabin, bruised and hollow-eyed, her spirit fractured as she mechanically resumed chores, the betrothal now accelerated to bind her tighter. The event rippled through the family, children averting eyes, adults exchanging grim nods, reinforcing the invisible chains that held them all, a reminder that flight meant not freedom, but recapture and the unrelenting violence required to preserve their twisted purity. In the flickering candlelight of a hidden attic alcove, Dr. Theodore Brennan pried open a dust-covered chest that Elijah had forbidden anyone to touch, its lock rusted but yielding to his persistent curiosity during a rare moment. Alone. Inside were stacks of hidden diaries, their leather covers warped by years of damp mountain air, pages brittle and stained with ink that bled like old wounds. These were not the formal ledgers he'd seen before, but intimate confessions scrawled by generations of Donnellys, women mostly, whose voices had been silenced in life but screamed from the grave in hurried script. The earliest entries, from the family's arrival in Montana, spoke of isolation as a virtue, a shield against a world that persecuted their kind. But as the years folded inward, mating only within the bloodline, the tone shifted to unease. Whispers of children born wrong, with minds that wandered into shadows, seeing things that weren't there, figures in the treetops beckoning, voices from the well-promising escape. One matriarch described nights plagued by visions of ancestral ghosts, their faces melting into grotesque masks, accusing her of tainting the purity she was sworn to protect. Deeper in, the madness deepened. A journal from Elijah's own mother detailed escalating hallucinations, walls breathing with the lungs of the dead, insects crawling beneath her skin though none were visible, driving her to claw at her arms until they bled. She wrote of inherited frailties, fits of rage that came unbidden, periods of catatonia where she'd stare vacant-eyed for days, the family believing it divine testing. Sons and daughters followed suit, their entries fragmented, words looping in repetitive despair, confessing to hearing the blood itself cry out in protest against its confinement. The psychological toll etched itself in every line, diminished wits that made simple tasks labyrinths, moods swinging from euphoric whispers to violent outbursts, a creeping insanity passed down like a cursed heirloom, amplified with each generation's closer union. Brennan's hands trembled as he read of suicides veiled as accidents, of relatives locked in sheds during episodes where they'd rave about demons born of their own flesh. These were not mere hardships of frontier life, but the inexorable unraveling of minds warped by recessive shadows emerging from the gene pool's stagnation, delusions, and derangement woven into the very lineage Elijah so fiercely guarded. As footsteps echoed below, signaling the family's return, Brennan hastily concealed the diaries, the weight of their revelations settling like grave dirt on his soul, the true horror not in bodies deformed, but in psyches fractured across decades, hallucinations and madness a legacy as binding as blood. As the snows began to thaw in tentative spring drips from the eaves, a new presence intruded upon the Donnelly homestead's fragile equilibrium, a weathered Ford truck rumbling up the overgrown track, its tires churning mud where no vehicle had ventured in years. Behind the wheel sat Harlan Reed, a persistent investigator from the State Health Department in Helena, his arrival heralded by distant engine growls that set the family's dogs into frantic barking and sent children scattering like startled fowl. Reed had come sniffing after reports, vague whispers from valley traders about strange folk in the high country, missed census filings, children never registered for school, and now a tip from a concerned doctor who'd passed through months prior, Brennan himself, who had finally escaped during a brief melt and filed anonymous concerns that refused to stay buried. Armed with official papers and a camera slung around his neck, Reed approached the porch with the confident stride of authority, demanding answers about welfare checks and potential quarantine risks, his voice carrying the clipped assurance of bureaucracy. Elijah met him at the gate, flanked by Caleb and Josiah, their shotguns held low but unmistakable, faces hardened into masks of defiance. The confrontation unfolded in terse exchanges, Reed pressing for entry to interview residents, citing laws on public health and child protection, while Elijah countered with claims of private land and religious exemption, his words laced with veiled threats of trespass. The family watched from windows and doorways, their collective unease palpable, a ripple of fear spreading as Reed's questions probed too close. Inquiries about birth defects, inbreeding rumors circulating in distant saloons, the isolation that raised red flags in official ledgers. Tensions escalated when Reed spotted young Miriam through a window, her bruises faded but posture broken, and demanded to speak with her alone. Elijah's refusal ignited shouts, Reed retreating only when barrels rose higher, but not before snapping photographs that captured blurred faces and the homestead's forbidding aura. His departure left the air charged, the family convening in urgent council, voices rising in accusation and panic, fears that the outsider would return with deputies, unravel their carefully guarded world. The crumbling facade forced confrontations long avoided, Elijah raging at perceived weaknesses that invited scrutiny, siblings exchanging blame for lapses in vigilance, while Brennan, still trapped by lingering mudslides, sensed the no to himself as the noose of exposure tightened around the Donnellys' shadowed existence. In the tense aftermath of Harlan Reed's intrusion, as the Donnelly family barricaded doors and whispered plans in the flickering lamplight, young Josiah, the quiet one with his spindly fingers and haunted sketches, cracked under the mounting pressure. Cornered by Elijah's furious interrogations about lapses in security, Josiah confessed in a trembling voice, his words spilling like poison from a long-sealed vial, revealing truths that shattered the patriarch's iron control. It began, he said, not with their Irish ancestors' flight from famine, but with deliberate intent rooted in unethical pursuits far beyond simple purity. Hidden correspondence, passed down through generations and concealed in a false-bottomed Bible, tied the Donnellys to a cadre of 19th-century scientists, fringe eugenicists operating in secret societies across Europe and the emerging American East. These men, obsessed with crafting superior human traits amid the era's burgeoning fascination with heredity, had identified the family as ideal subjects, resilient immigrants willing to isolate for the promise of enhanced strength, intelligence, and longevity. Funds arrived sporadically, gold coins in unmarked pouches left at remote drop points, accompanied by letters instructing closer unions to concentrate desirable qualities, robustness against disease, keen senses honed by the wild. The Donnellys, swayed by promises of divine favor mirrored in scientific rhetoric, embraced the directive, viewing themselves as chosen vessels in a grand experiment to breed a new aristocracy, untainted by the masses' weaknesses. Josiah's betrayal unfolded as he produced one such letter, its wax seal cracked but legible, signed by a pseudonymous doctor extolling progress reports on physical uniformity and endurance, ignoring the rising toll of defects as mere pruning. Elijah's face twisted in rage and dawning horror. He had enforced the rules blindly, believing them ancestral wisdom, not pawns in shadowy pursuits for traits like heightened pain tolerance or rapid healing, qualities tested cruelly on the frontier but ultimately warped into monstrosities. The revelation fractured loyalties, Bridie weeping over manipulated bloodlines, Caleb smashing fists into walls at the deceit, while Miriam's eyes gleamed with vindication. Josiah, driven by his own creeping madness and resentment, exposed how the experiment persisted through willful ignorance, benefactors long dead but their legacy a self-perpetuating cage. As accusations flew, the homestead echoed with the sounds of a family unraveling, victims of unethical ambition now confronting the architects within their own veins as thunder cracked over the Bitterroot Peaks, mirroring the storm brewing within the Donnelly homestead, the fragile alliances shattered in a night of reckoning. Josiah's confession hung in the air like smoke from a fresh-fired shotgun, igniting Elijah's fury. He lunged at his son with a roar, fists swinging in blind betrayal, accusing him of inventing lies to destroy the bloodline he had sworn to protect. Caleb joined the fray, grappling with Josiah in defense of tradition, their grunts and curses echoing the primal violence that had long simmered beneath obedience. Bridie and Miriam, fueled by years of suppressed rage, turned on the men, screaming revelations from the diaries, accusations of madness inherited, of children lost to the cold earth not by God's will but by deliberate hands pruning the weak. The cabin erupted into pandemonium, furniture overturned, lanterns smashed, spilling oil that caught flame in erratic bursts, casting dancing shadows on walls stained with generations of despair. Fists met flesh in brutal exchanges, siblings tearing at one another as buried horrors surfaced, confessions of hidden graves in the backfields where deformed infants lay interred, unmarked and UN mourned, sacrifices to the illusion of superiority. Metaphorical skeletons clawed free alongside literal ones when, in the melee, a loose floorboard gave way, spilling oiled cloths wrapped around tiny, preserved remains, shriveled forms with fused limbs and vacant skulls, evidence of selective mercy killings to excise flaws from the lineage. The sight froze combatants mid-blow, gasps turning to wails as the full weight of their complicity crashed down. Elijah, enforcer turned unwitting monster, the women, bearers of cursed wombs, the young, inheritors of decay. Chaos spiraled, flames licking higher, consuming curtains and beams, while outside, Harlan Reed's returning posse, alerted by distant glow, approached with rifles drawn. Screams blended with the crackle of fire and the howl of wind, family bonds fracturing in a maelstrom of violence and truth, revelations pouring forth like blood from fresh wounds, admissions of hallucinations driving acts of cruelty, of experiments embraced as destiny now exposed as abomination. In that inferno of body and soul, the Donnellys confronted the abyss they had nurtured, their world collapsing in a symphony of shattering illusions and unrelenting horror. Amid the smoldering ruins of the Donnelly homestead, as dawn's pale light filtered through acrid smoke and sheriff's deputies picked through the ashes, the survivors, Elijah blooded but unbowed, Miriam clutching a singed diary, Josiah silent in cuffs, faced interrogation that promised exposure at last. Harlan Reed, triumphant yet shaken by the carnage, pressed for answers, certain the nightmare had ended with the fire's cleansing roar. Yet as evidence emerged, a final, insidious twist uncoiled, blurring the stark lines between victim and perpetrator in ways that chilled deeper than any grave. Scattered documents, miraculously spared by flame, revealed correspondence not severed with the old eugenicists' deaths, but evolved subtle payments from anonymous trusts persisting into the modern era, routed through shell foundations obsessed with genetic outliers. Elijah, far from mere enforcer, had knowingly continued the work, corresponding under aliases with contemporary researchers who viewed the Donnellys as a priceless longitudinal study, a closed population yielding rare data on recessive traits, inbreeding depression, and unexpected adaptations masked as deformities. Miriam's defiant testimony exposed the deepest betrayal. Some family members, Elijah chief among them, had embraced their role, volunteering blood samples during clandestine meetings in distant towns, prideful in their uniqueness, believing the afflictions were evolutionary steps toward superiority. Josiah's rebellion, too, twisted upon scrutiny, his confession not born of horror but calculated sabotage, hoping to force intervention that would relocate them to facilities where the experiment could proceed under clinical oversight, trading mountain isolation for controlled observation. Even the children, wide-eyed and malformed, recited lessons drilled since birth not of purity alone, but of destiny as living science, their suffering a noble contribution to human advancement. Deputies unearthed a hidden radio transmitter, its logs showing recent contacts with parties eager for updates on resilience markers, heightened pain thresholds, unusual healing rates amid the madness. The revelation recast the entire tragedy: victims not wholly innocent, perpetrators not entirely external, for the Donnellys had long since internalized the experiment, perpetuating it through generations with a zeal that outlasted its creators. As authorities led them away, Elijah's flint-hard eyes gleamed not with defeat but quiet satisfaction, whispering to Miriam that the bloodline would endure, scattered now but observed, studied, immortalized in data no fire could consume. The experiment lived on, no longer confined to Montana's shadows but diffused into the wider world, its subjects complicit carriers of a legacy that refused to die.